Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Amaida Mir and I am assistant professor in Department of Anatomy. Today our topic of discussion is the model of brain. We will discuss it inshallah thoroughly and I will try my best to tell you each lobe of the brain with all its gyri and sulci and with all its functional areas. So we will start it from the basic structure of brain. So as you know that human brain has two cerebral hemisphere, one which is on the right side is called the right cerebral hemisphere and one which is on the left side is called the left cerebral hemisphere. And the brain has four lobes. One is the frontal lobe. This whole is frontal from here up to here. Behind the frontal lobe is parietal lobe. This whole is called parietal. From here up to here. Below and behind the parietal is occipital lobe. This is occipital, and below the parietal and in front of the occipital is temporal lobe. So this is temporal lobe. So this whole is called frontal. This is called parietal. This is called occipital, and this is temporal lobe. Next is the boundaries of the lobes of the brain. So first of all we will start from the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe has four boundaries. One is called anterior, other is posterior, then inferior and superior boundary. The interior boundary has a pole which is called the frontal pole. Lower conical part is called the frontal pole, which is the anterior boundary of the frontal lobe. The posterior boundary which divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and this is called the central sulcus, that starts from the top of the frontal and the parietal lobe and runs downward, and in this model this is maroon in color or red in color, and this is called the central sulcus. In front of the central sulcus is the frontal lobe and behind the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. So this is the line of demarcation between the frontal and the parietal lobe, and this central sulcus is also called the Ronaldo's sulcus. This is the inferior boundary of the frontal lobe, which is called the lateral sulcus or lateral fissure. This extends from the anterior part or the anterior pole of the temporal lobe and runs behind, but this sulcus will finish over here. Next, the superior boundary, and the superior boundary is this, the superior border. The whole superior boundary. So we have completed all the four boundaries of the frontal lobe. I will repeat every boundary again. One is the anterior boundary, which is the anterior pole. Next, the posterior boundary, that is the central sulcus or Ronaldo's sulcus. Superior boundary, that this uppermost part is called the superior boundary, and the inferior boundary or the border, which is this is called the lateral sulcus or lateral fissure. Next, the borders are the boundaries of the parietal lobe. The anterior boundary of the parietal lobe is again the central sulcus. As I told before, that the central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Anterior is the frontal lobe and the posterior to the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. Posterior boundary of the parietal lobe is very complicated. This is a perfect model for the posterior boundary of the parietal lobe. The posterior boundary extends from the parieto-occipital sulcus. From here, this is parieto-occipital because this is the parietal lobe and this is the occipital lobe. So between the parietal and occipital lobe is a sulcus which is a parieto-occipital sulcus. Then the posterior boundary runs from here, parieto-occipital sulcus, and it will move on the front surface of the cerebral cortex and it will end over here, and here this portion is called pre-occipital notch, means in front of the occipital lobe. So this is pre-occipital notch. Again I will tell you the posterior boundary of the parietal lobe, which extends from the parieto-occipital sulcus from here. Then an imaginary line, we will draw that line from here, and that imaginary line will end over here, and this is called the pre-occipital notch. Now the superior boundary, that is superior boundary is again formed by the upper or the superior border as in the frontal lobe. As in the frontal lobe, same in the parietal lobe, the inferior boundary extends from this lateral sulcus or the fissure, and that will run up to the imaginary line which we have drawn for the formation of the posterior boundary of the parietal lobe. So the posterior boundary will extend like this from here up to here, and the inferior boundary will run from the lateral sulcus from here up to here. This is the inferior boundary. I will repeat all the boundaries of the parietal lobe. This is the superior boundary, which is the superior border. The interior boundary is the central sulcus or the Ronaldo's sulcus that divides the frontal and the parietal lobe. Posterior boundary extends from the parieto-occipital sulcus, and from here this will run over here up to the preoccipital notch, and the inferior boundary from the lateral sulcus by an imaginary line behind, and this line will fuse with the line which we have drawn for the formation of the boundary of the posterior lobe over here. So these are all the 4 boundaries of the parietal lobe. Now the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe has again interior, superior, inferior and the posterior boundaries. The interior boundary is the anterior pole, like the frontal lobe which has an anterior boundary which is the frontal pole. Same as in the temporal lobe, the anterior boundary is found by the temporal pole. The superior boundary which is found by this lateral sulcus, which is also called the Selvian fissure, and this will form the superior boundary of the temporal lobe. Then the inferior boundary which is formed by the infrolateral border. This is infro and lateral border. This will form the inferior boundary of the temporal lobe. Posterior boundary is just similar to the inferior boundary of the parietal lobe, which is formed by an imaginary line that we have drawn from the lateral sulcus. This line runs behind and then it will fuse with the line that runs from the parieto-occipital sulcus for the formation of the posterior boundary of the parietal lobe. Then this line extends from here to reach up to the preoccipital notch, and this is the point where the both lines will fuse. This will form the posterior boundary of the temporal lobe. So again I will repeat all the boundaries. The anterior boundary or border which is formed by the temporal pole, then the superior which is formed by the lateral boundary which is formed by the lateral sulcus, the inferior boundary which is formed by the infrolateral surface or infrolateral border, and the posterior boundary which is formed by an imaginary line that will run from the lateral sulcus and fuse with the line. The line runs from here to the preoccipital notch, and this is the point of the junction of these both lines. Now the last one is occipital lobe. Occipital lobe has 2 boundaries, one is the anterior, one is the posterior. The posterior boundary of the occipital lobe is formed by the occipital pole. This is the occipital pole, and the anterior boundary which is formed by again the same, the imaginary line that we have drawn for the posterior boundary of the parietal lobe that runs from the parieto-occipital sulcus. Then this line will run downwards to reach up to the preoccipital notch. So this is the point of the junction of the line. This whole area will form the occipital lobe, and this whole part forms the temporal lobe, this whole part forms the parietal lobe, and this whole part forms the frontal lobe. So we have completed all the boundaries of 4 lobes of the brain.